Terrific. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. My name is Jeff Hahn, and I'll be facilitating the afternoon webinar series for Corwin Press. Welcome to Three Faces of Quality Questioning, Self-Assessment, Dialogue, and Formative Feedback. I'd like to now turn the meeting over to Jill Margulies, Marketing Manager for Corwin Press, to introduce our presenter today.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. So we're just closing out our Monday afternoon webinar series. If you've joined them before or joining today, you know it's a free series that we make available. We record everything. So if you have any colleagues who wanted to join but weren't able to, everything's recorded. So once this is done, we'll send you out an email in a few days, so nobody has to miss it. The last two we have coming up, we have Paul Bloomberg, Mark Pickford on leading impact teams, and Charlotte Danielson on leading professional conversations. If you could go to the next slide, please, Jackie. So today we have the wonderful and charming Jackie Walsh presenting. Unfortunately, Beth had a last-minute emergency come up, so she's not able to join the webinar. Because of that, just please be patient with us and with Jackie. She's running the webinar herself. So if there's any, delay in the presentation or anything, just be patient. We will be answering questions, like Jeff said. Just go ahead and use that chat feature. But again, because it's just Jackie, if we missed any of your questions, we'll be taking more at the end. And I just want to tell you a little bit about Jackie. So she's an independent educational consultant. She partners with educators across the country to enhance teaching, learning, and leading in classrooms, schools, and districts. Her professional passion is questioning for both student and adult learning. She's based in Montgomery, Alabama, and Jackie is the lead consultant for the Alabama Best Practices Center, working with networks of school and district teams, instructional partners, and superintendents. She works with schools and districts across the country to customize a design that will engage teachers and school leaders in reflecting and learning related to quality questioning. In addition to all of her work in education, Jackie's most proud of being a mother and a grandmother. So now I'm going to hand it over to Jackie to go ahead and get started on the webinar.
Thank you, Jill, and thank you, Jeffrey, and welcome, everyone. I am delighted to join with you this afternoon to talk about my passion, one of my passions, quality questioning. And this afternoon, we want to focus on the three faces of quality questioning. And I imagine you were wondering what they are. The three faces, in our view, are the face of quality questioning that really promotes student self-assessment. And then that other dimension that really prompts classroom dialogue between and among students and teachers. And then very importantly, the face of questioning that enables teachers to engage in formative assessment to get that feedback that is so important to determine next steps in learning, which may be to give students feedback. I would say to you that this afternoon's webinar comes to a large extent from our second edition of Quality Questioning, just published by Corwin Press last week. Beth and I are really excited to have had the opportunity to update a book that we wrote 11 years ago. We call it our baby. This new edition is, we say, more of a rewrite than a revision, but we're excited to have had a good base to draw upon. I've always thought it a little oxymoronic to try to present on questioning, because questioning is, to me, a process that really engages folks in talking to one another. We're a little limited this afternoon by the medium, but I would really encourage you to chat in Twitter or tweet in Twitter one to another, engage in conversation using the hashtag quality questioning. And I am at Question to Think. If you're not following me now, I'd love for you to, and Beth is at Beth Fat. So I think if we limit the hashtag to quality questioning, you can get in more dialogue. And I have a colleague here in Alabama, I believe, Jackie Flowers, who's going to help kind of manage those tweets and get some patterns of conversation to me. So with that, I want to turn to this slide and ask each of you if you would at my and Beth's invitation, read a question that is on the screen that is one of our essential questions for sure, has been over our time of working with classroom questioning. But we find this question more important today than ever in our professional careers. We do believe that if each one of us as educators would pursue this question, would embrace it, would continue to pursue it with our students, with our colleagues, with all of our publics, that we could contribute greatly to the forward movement of our country, which we are saddened to see so divided. So I invite you to reflect on this question and to think about how quality questioning can help us move forward. So with that, we will move on to preview the afternoon. Oh, I should say before we go further, the PowerPoint will be archived along with some videos that we'll be showing this afternoon. So if I race through the slides too quickly for you, please know that they will be on the Corwin website later. And one more preliminary, if you grab a sheet of paper and a pen, pencil, something to write with, I hope you will be reflecting and interacting with yourself as well as using the Twitter function and the chat. So if you're all set, let's go. To preview the afternoon, we have three big chunks. The first content piece that we will look at is what we call the 6 Ps framework. It is our organizer for quality questioning. The second focus for the afternoon will be related to the title of the session. It will be, how does quality questioning support these 3 high-impact learning processes that involve both students and teachers? And then thirdly, we will hope to be able to pursue 3 sets of expectations that really are essential to activating students' and teachers' engagement in questioning to the end of producing that self-assessment, dialogue, and formative feedback. So you see the 3 sets of expectations we will look at as we close out the afternoon. But let's begin with the 6 Ps framework, which is our organizer for the core components of quality questioning, of which there's 6. You see that we really view questioning as a process that depends upon a student and teacher partnership that ultimately is required to reculture our more traditional classrooms. We can present the framework as a cycle. The only limitation here is that it really is not just sequential. There's a lot of interaction between and among the components. We're going to quickly explore the 5 outer circles of the framework, and I'll ask you to remember that the inter piece, that partner with students, is to us the most important of the 6. But I think logically we would begin with preparing the question. Careful preparation of questions prior to the beginning of a class we think is critical if we are to connect our students with content in the way that we need to engage them, so that the questions are aligned with standards, but they meet students where they are in terms of both readiness and personal interest. We think these questions, too, must be prepared in advance if we're to be mindful of assessing student progress toward those learning targets with which the questions are aligned, and if we are to deepen that student learning, extend it at appropriate points in the lesson. In our framework, there are 4 indicators or behaviors associated with the framing of quality questions. You see these 4 on the screen, and I hope you would agree that they would be critically important for a question that would engage students as we desire. Second component, present the question. It's not enough to have a good question if it falls on deaf ears or if it is heard by only a few in the class. Our outcome here is that all students understand the question and feel accountable and comfortable offering their responses. Again, 4 indicators associated with presenting the question. We'll have an opportunity this afternoon to explore these more fully as we look at their involvement with effective dialogue and formative feedback. Component 3, prompt student thinking. Have you ever posed a question and you got those blank looks? Have you ever named a student to respond and you got a shrug of the shoulder, or maybe a 1 to 3 word response? Prompting student thinking is about those behaviors that teachers can use to communicate to students that they are responsible for thinking of the question. They are responsible for coming up with what they think, and we will give them supports. We will give them scaffolds that will enable them to hopefully surface their thinking. Prompting student thinking helps make student thinking visible. Next, process student response. A student responds, but it is perhaps an incomplete response, or perhaps a response that embodies a misconception. What do? We suggest follow-up questions, perhaps leading to scaffolds, but we'll look later today at just what to do with that kind of formative feedback, or depending upon the formative feedback, what to do. Processing student responses also can take us into the realm of dialogue and discussion, so that students, if they have a requisite level of surface knowledge, a requisite level of understanding, can really take that thinking deeper and can take that knowledge to an even deeper level. Here are the behaviors associated with processing, and I think I've alluded to a number of them already. And then there's polishing. I think that none of us believes we have become the master questioners yet. We always have room for reflecting on, so how did it go? How did it go for my learners? What if I had done this? What about that think time? One of my favorite topics. So in polishing, we do suggest not only personal reflection that might lead to setting some interim goals for improvement, we think reflecting with colleagues with whom you are hopefully collaboratively developing those quality questions can be very powerful. And perhaps most important of all is reflecting with your students. How's it going? How is this supporting your learning? What are you doing? Speaking of which, partner with students is really our core component in this framework, as you saw it pictured in the center of the graphic. It is new. When Beth and I began our work with questioning some decades ago, it was our belief, I think along with many, that you worked on enhancing teacher behaviors. You worked on improving your own development of questions, the way you presented them, the use of your think time. It didn't take us long, well, maybe longer than it should, a few years or more, to realize that teachers really cannot do quality questioning to students. We must do it with them. And questioning is perhaps one of the best ways, we believe it is, to help students assume increased ownership for their learning and their thinking. And so as we partner with students, there are 4 key areas where we believe we need to engage them. And when we get to the expectations at the close of the afternoon, you'll note a number of real strategic areas for partnering. So that's the framework. We'll refer to it as we look at our 3 phases of questioning, but I wanted you to have that overview first. And also just to kind of reinforce our direction for the afternoon, Dylan William, who was Paul Black, you may remember, wrote Inside the Black Box years ago and kind of brought formative assessment to the fore, penned this sentence, and I always say, I wish I had. I suggest there are only two good reasons to ask questions in class: to cause thinking and to provide information to the teacher about what to do next. So there you have our dialogue and our formative assessment. I would add to this, and to provide information to the student that the student can decide, help the student decide what to do next. So now to the topic of the afternoon, the three phases of quality questioning. We'll begin with questioning for student self-assessment. And I invite you to read the quote on the screen and just key in on important words or ideas. Do you agree with this statement? In a previous book, Beth and I wrote Thinking Through Quality Questioning. We really focused on the metacognitive development of students through the use of questioning. And that certainly relates directly to this concept of student self-assessment. So we want to begin with this. And as we do, I invite you to read a vignette that will come up on the next slide. And as you read, here's a chance for you to pick up that pen or pencil and jot down, maybe start a little conversation. I want you to think about this student whose vignette is presented, and just imagine what her teachers might be doing to encourage this type of self-assessment, and maybe what her teachers in the past have done to help her develop these metacognitive skills. So just take a half-minute or so to read, jot down, and react to this vignette. Don't you wish all students had inner voices like this? And I love the notion of the self-questioning and the self-assessment. To us, this comment by a fifth grader so embodies what we hope questions can mean to students. I'm hoping we're getting a little going on the conversation end as we move into a little bit more detail about self-assessment. You know, self-assessment embodies two specific skills that are referenced in John Hattie's work on visible learning. Those two are self-verbalization and self-questioning. Hattie notes that these two have a very high effect size on student achievement. In fact, in his 2012 publication, he noted this to be 21 out of 150 variables. I'm a little reticent to name the rank of these high-impact variables at this point, because those of you who know John Hattie's work know that he never stops and his rankings change, maybe almost weekly, I don't know. But I think it suffices to say that self-verbalization and self-questioning do have a high effect size, and that quality questions can focus student attention to catalyze this type of productive self-talk and self-questioning, if we craft them with this end in mind. So just how does student self-assessment fit in with our posing of questions? This graphic, I hope, shows that relationship, that a teacher question should prompt, we hope, student self-assessment if they know that to be the goal and if they have learned these metacognitive skills. That self-assessment, we hope, would come or result to making their thinking visible in the form of a written or oral response. Oral response has been used by teachers as feedback to ourselves so that we can determine what to do next. It might be feedback to the student that would then kind of reignite student self-assessment through monitoring, posing of questions, and so forth. Questioning to facilitate student self-assessment has a number of characteristics, and I share here 5 or 6 with you. Here, certainly, targeted questions are important, and by that we mean questions aligned with learning targets, learning intentions, learning goals, whatever your nomenclature. So importantly is the affective side, that the questions be invitational, not interrogational, that teachers encourage all students to use the question to think about what they think they know and to think about what may still be confusing them. Likewise, these questions need to be measured. Students need the time to reflect on the question, to connect it to their current knowledge and experience, and time to begin this self-assessment, identifying the gaps in understanding. This, of course, requires think time, and this is the think time 1. Some of you know this as wait time. Beth and I prefer the think time expression because it names what students should do with the pause, what many of them will call that awkward silence until they learn how to use it. Next, questions that prompt student self-assessment need to be timely, coming at the point in the lesson where they can be useful to students for self-assessment. And finally, we hope that they are transparent, that teachers and students alike realize the value of the question because it can help make student thinking visible and it can lead to the sharing of those self-assessments with the teacher. That is our first phase of quality questioning, questioning for student self-assessment. I'll pause a moment and just let you reflect. To what extent do you plan and use classroom questions to prompt student self-assessment? How often do you talk with your students about using questions that you pose even to the whole class to really assess their thinking? Is this the way they view questioning? If not, we'd really encourage you to consider the potential benefits of questions used in this mode, even as they're used for other purposes. A question for self-assessment would most likely lead to a question for classroom dialogue. And we want to define dialogue here as really a pattern of classroom interaction that involves moving students to students, talking one to another, that lengthens student to teacher interactions, that really moves, as John Hattie would say, teachers away from a very extensive use of monologue to a very generous use of dialogue. We have an example of a video of a 3rd grade math class that we think does evidence a teacher who has with her students made that transition from monologue to dialogue. And I'm going to ask Jeffrey if he would take over the screen and put this video up. As he does, and you go inside Andrea Fonseca's classroom, she is a teacher at Rose Garden Elementary in SCUC ISD. I hope there's some of you out there this afternoon outside of San Antonio. As you view this video, would you just note anything that suggests that Adria and her students are transitioning to dialogue, that they really are honoring those student voices? So Jeffrey, if you'll take it away.
Foresight. This is a safe learning.
Okay, there is your summary. Don't you love it? So, Jeffrey, I think you're getting this back to me, and you may have to remind me my screen, right? There we go. What behaviors did Adria and her students use that you associate with dialogue? I hope that you were able to identify a number as you viewed this, and that you're chatting with one another about it. There's your summary. So we'd like to move on and look again, even as we did with self-assessment, at the essential features of dialogue. And I'll give credit here to John Hattie, who in his Visible Learning for Teachers identified these key features. We've taken a little liberty with our explanation of them. We would say questioning for dialogue is purposeful, again, because of that pre-planning of a limited number of questions that are aligned with learning intentions or learning targets. We'd say that questioning for dialogue leads to collective action, students learning together through speaking and listening to one another and not just to their teacher. How did the third grade math class square up against those two criteria? Then we say it's reciprocal. The teacher and students speak, they listen to, they question, and they learn from one another as they share ideas and consider alternatives. This is true in all academic content areas. And I would say it's true even as students are developing that surface knowledge and when they are deepening that knowledge. Questioning for dialogue is supportive. How important is this one? Students know that they no longer live in a right answer classroom, that they're in a classroom where they're encouraged to surface their thinking, knowing that sometimes wrong, incorrect answers lead to the most important learnings. They're helped through and by the scaffolding of teachers and sometimes by the scaffolding from peers. Questioning for dialogue is cumulative. It moves. It goes in a direction. Students build on their own ideas and they build on their classmates' contributions. With regard to building on their own ideas, you may recall that John Hattie says elaboration is another one of those variables for students that has a very high effect size, high impact on their learning. But Hattie has found that student responses to teacher questions too often do not fit the dialogue mode. In fact, 70% of the time, according to Hattie's research, student responses to teacher questions are 2 to 3 words only, less than 5 seconds. Of course, this is a result of his meta-analyses. It doesn't represent every classroom. I wonder what you think. And Jeffrey, if you'd put the poll up, curious out there, the students whom you serve, would you say this is true for them? Or 70% of the time, do you find their responses 2 to 3 words, less than 5 seconds? Is your perception yes? Is your perception no? You know, maybe you don't know. Maybe you've never really thought about focusing on that piece. So would you respond to the poll and submit? And I know that after the responses are in, Jeffrey will give us the great reveal.
While we're waiting for those poll results, just a reminder to everyone, there's a great conversation happening right now on Twitter with that hashtag quality questioning. And if you have any questions for Jackie, you can ask them there as well, and we'll try to get to them at some point during this or near the end. Thanks.
What? Thanks, Jill. And I'm scrolling through and seeing Kathy Dyer. Kathy, you are really engaging here with Connie and Beth and Jackie and Allison Carpenter. Hello out there. Sabrina Frost. I can't scroll fast enough to read all the names, but welcome, friends, and I hope some new friends. A big shout out to Nicole and Jackie, and here's our poll. Oh. Has it ended, Jeffrey? Jeffrey?
Looks like we had 52 people respond, Jackie. And it looks like 22 of those 52 said yes.
I'm seeing that. So we could add to Hattie's research base from our observations, I guess, or could validate it. And, you know, this really stands out to me when I read a classroom transcript. So many times you'll see lines of teacher talk and then 2 or 3 words from students. So this is what we want to move away from. Thank you, Jeffrey. And I think if we can move on, I guess I'll eliminate the poll result and move to the next slide, except I'm unable to do it for some reason. Jeffrey, Jill, can you help out? I'm not able to advance the slides for some reason. Oh, there we go. Thank you. Okay, so we really emphasize this move from monologue to dialogue because it does have such a large effect size, over twice the average effect size, an effect size that would say if we are intentionally engaging our students in dialogue consistently, intentionally, day in and day out, according to Hattie's research, students would experience not just 1 year's gain for 1 year's seat time, but really almost 2. And here's his conclusion. Classrooms are dominated by teacher talk. And one of the themes of his original publication is that the proportion of teacher talk to listening needs to change to far less talk and far more listening. We liken that to kind of changing the dynamics of a baseball game. We've used this graphic for many years, and I think it first came to me that for many students, classroom questioning is like coming to bat 1 time a day where the teacher is pitching to you a question, the teacher is reacting and responding, the teacher is playing, you know, first base, second base, outfield, shortstop, catcher, and even umpire. And it's a pretty boring game for students. What we would imagine for students is that they would not only be the batters in the classroom, but they would be pitching some questions, they would be responding to one another, and they would be opening up that field of play. So that was as short and sweet as we can make it for dialogue, and we move to the third phase of questioning, and that is questioning for formative feedback to teachers. Understand that these 3 are not discrete, individual unto themselves, that one question can prompt that student self-assessment, can lead to dialogue, which in turn gives that formative feedback to teachers. We believe that the answers that teachers get to questions in classrooms are one of the most important sources of formative feedback for both teacher and students. And that is one of our fundamental premises that underpins quality questioning. Too many times we don't get the full impact because we haven't carefully crafted the questions and we are not listening to student responses as feedback to us. So we think intentionality in this can be so important. How important is it? Twice the effect size of the average teacher intervention once again. And you who know Hattie's work know that his finding is it is the feedback to the teacher about what students can and cannot do that is more powerful than feedback to the students. And it really does necessitate a different way of interacting with and respecting students, a way that we hope we have encompassed in quality questioning. feedback from student responses, it comes in different forms. There are different types. Sometimes the student response will reveal a gap in student knowledge as there's that discrepancy between a student response and the intention that would be embedded in the learning target. Sometimes it's not a knowledge gap, but it's a discrepancy in the kind of cognitive processing that was intended. And I think certainly with our, now we can almost no longer say new, but with the last wave of standards, so much more emphasis upon cognitive processing. Both of these require a teacher decision as to what to do next to help that student or students in the class. Could be to scaffold through prompting. It could be to get behind the students by asking a simple question, what makes you say that? It could be to back up and reteach because we discern that there's wide misunderstanding in the class. It could be that the response reveals the student is on course, and then we still may want to ask what makes you say that in order to help that student deepen their thinking by providing evidence or reasoning. We have another short video, and I think you can go ahead and begin posting that one for us, Jeffrey. This comes from a 5th grade classroom, again, in SCUC ISD outside of San Antonio, Texas. Dennis Howe's classroom. Dennis is engaged in doing just what we're focused on now, gathering that feedback from students and using it to inform his next steps. As you view this, would you look for what and how Dennis is collecting the feedback and then also what he's doing with it? So roll it, Jeffrey.
So as the students are working, I monitor them by moving.
Assessment and feedback with those math students. In just about a minute and a half, I think you'll see a lot of teacher moves to the end of getting and using formative feedback from student responses. So Jeffrey, you ready to give it back to me?
You're all set. There you go.
Okay, here we go. So I was scanning the Twitter feed as we were viewing the video, and I want to invite those of you who are not on. It's, you know, hashtag quality questioning, and I'm seeing a lot of my Alabama friends chatting. Big shout out there to Kathy Gatzenheimer, my colleague at the Alabama Best Practices Center. Great to have you with us this afternoon, Kathy, and all the partners. So moving on to our next slide. I think embedded in formative assessment and feedback is this notion that we can't make assumptions about student responses. It's essential that we explore their thinking before we assume that they have understood. Just because we say it doesn't mean they get it. They need to say it typically in order to get it. So questioning for responses to use for feedback can really enhance our effectiveness. And finally, here are the features of questioning for formative assessment and feedback. I think you'll see some patterns over the three that we have looked at, the three phases of questioning. Again, the questions are focused. They're strategic. Dylan Williams calls these hinge questions. Pose a question, students understand, the hinge moves forward. Pose a question, they don't, when they have to back up, even to the point of what Ron Berger would say is catching and releasing. That is reteaching to ensure that clarity is there for all students. Again, the caring, very similar to the invitational feature that I mentioned in reference to student self-assessment. But students, if they're going to offer that answer about which they are unsure, if they're going to risk a wrong response, they've got to believe that the teacher really cares about their learning. Right, wrong, that they want authenticity. Questioning for formative feedback requires commitment on the part of the teacher and the students, commitment particularly to listening. Listening to understand the thinking behind the student's response. It requires thoughtfulness, using that think time for the listening, for the reflection, and teacher using that second pause, that think time too, to really frame a follow-up question or statement that could help the student move to the next level. Hattie, again, underscores the value of listening. He says the most important task of teachers is to listen. And I love this distinction between evaluative listening, which I think most of us would agree is what typically happens in classrooms. We listen to determine right or wrong. Hattie says we should be doing more interpretive listening, attending carefully to what students say so that we can learn about the thinking behind their comments. Okay, we've kind of set out now the three phases of quality questioning: self-assessment, dialogue, and formative feedback to teacher. All three of these depend upon that core component of quality questioning, that is partnering with students. And in this case, we believe partnering with students to help embed three sets of expectations into the classroom culture. Work with students to the extent that these expectations become normalized behavior. So we want to try to kind of cover these very quickly as we come to the close of our afternoon together. The expectations are around purposes of questions, use of think times, and responsibility for participation. So I've got another poll question for you. What do you think your students would say to this question? Why do you think your teachers ask questions in class? Is it A, to find out if students know the correct answer? Is it B, to encourage them to think? C, to find out if they're paying attention? Or D, to assess where they are in their learning? I know there may not be just one reason, but what would you say would be students thinking about the main reason teachers ask questions? Would you note A, B, C, or D? And we'll ask Jeffrey then, when the poll is completed, to put up the responses of our 50-some-odd participants out there.
While everyone's answering that, I'll just quickly mention, if you stick around until the end of the presentation, we will be giving you a discount code for 20% off the book. So that's coming up in the next 10 minutes. Thanks.
Right. Thank you, Jill. And I'm trying to talk real fast between now and the end, so we'll have a few minutes at the end for questions. And Jill tells me if 6:30 comes and there are some of you who are willing to stay on, that we can go beyond the 6:30 by a few minutes to take questions. I know you're thinking, and I'm still talking, but I'll also say that if you'll go to that Twitter feed, # quality questioning, we can do some chatting on there and some response to your questions. Ready to go, Jeffrey? People needed a lot of think time on this, huh? Poll is ended. Okay. Wow. Look at that. You know, it's interesting when we have asked this question in previous professional development sessions, asked teachers to imagine, we find that the great majority of elementary teachers respond A. Guess who answers C quite a bit? I can relate because I'm an old high school teacher myself, but secondary teachers are more apt to respond C than others. But I think, you know, it is encouraging that we have 22% at B and 20% at D. So 44, well, we're 42, we're moving on up. Can't do my math this afternoon. Thanks, Jeffrey, and I'm really wondering what you're thinking out there about that question. Look forward to seeing if we have questions or if you are commenting in the Twitter feed. So with regard to the purposes of questions, we would argue that there are 3 important beliefs and expectations that we hope our students develop related to quality questioning. We don't believe that most students come in our classroom doors already possessing these, so just take a look. Number 1, that we could eliminate right answer-oriented classrooms and convince our students that questions really are to help them learn through the thinking they do. That would require students accepting the importance of listening to all questions and to doing that self-assessment, responding with what they think they know, and certainly that they understand the value of incorrect responses. To convince students to move in that direction, we've got to have dialogue with them. Most don't believe that right now. I would really be willing to stake a lot of my, if not money, a lot of my credibility on that one. Second set of expectations, those of you who know me know it's my favorite theme song, Think Time. And this is just a review. Remember, you'll have this on the archive version, but there's the Think Time one, and you know that comes after we pose a question, before we name a student to answer. Minimum requirement, 3 to 5 seconds. Why? As we help students understand that awkward silence, they've got to know what to do with it. And to me, this visual really does convey, in a pretty clear manner, the idea that responding like questioning is a process, that students must go through at least 4 steps in order to have a chance of answering aloud. These are they. And I think the main point with the think time is some students move through this process much more rapidly than others. If we come to have a classroom that honors think time, we're going to have just, ipso facto, a more respectful classroom, respectful of different ways of processing, not just different outcomes of thinking. Think time 2, I think you know that is that awkward silence. After a student or speaker stops talking, it's that 3 to 5 seconds we give before offering feedback, follow-up question, or allowing other students to speak. This, we believe, so supports both student self-assessment and teacher assessment and feedback. You see what it allows students to do. And importantly, Think Time 1 gives us the opportunity as teachers to get in the mode of being able to identify that gap so that we can decide, not identify a gap, call to mind the acceptable response, so we'll be in a position to identify a gap. Also gives us a chance to decide who might this question best match. Who might want to pose this to? Think Time 2, powerful support for formative assessment of all sorts. I have come to believe that think times are perhaps the most critical element for successful in real class time formative assessment, because both students and teacher need time to think if they're to work. What kind of thinking do we as teachers need to do to use that student response as feedback and make those decisions? Here, I think, are 5 requisite kinds of thinking process. You know, I read recently, I think that teachers make a minimum of 1,500 decisions a day. These are some of the ones that have to be made just with the snap of a finger. So, in summary, during Think Time 1, if we looked earlier at what teacher does, here's what students do during Think Time 1, all students, we hope. And do note at the bottom of the page, forming a question if they need clarification of what's being asked. During Think Time 2, the speaking student has that opportunity to continue reflecting, to pose a question if there is one. What I think sometimes we really forget to do is help out the listening students understand their role during that second pause. That's when they should actively be engaged in assessing what they know, comparing it to what the speaker said, deciding if they agree or not, if they need to pose a question, and being ready for the teacher to ask them. If we're going to change student expectations for use of think times, we've got to counter some pretty deep-seated student beliefs, and you see these in the right column. The students in most classrooms, do think raising their hand immediately, getting that immediate reinforcement for a correct response, and being off the hook if someone else is named is just the rhythm of the classroom in which they've lived for years. We hope they'll learn these other behaviors. If they do, then they'll be moving to the third set of expectations, and that is responsibility for participation. Again, we've got a little poll. I don't know if we have time for it. Can we put it up, Jeffrey? You did in a hurry. Which of the following do you think best describes your low achievers' usual responses to classroom questions? Do they raise their hands? Do they depend upon a high-achieving classmate to volunteer? Do they know who will always have it and then listen? Or do they just check out when a question is posed that they're pretty sure doesn't relate to them or their knowledge? If you could quickly post your response so we can move on to the last couple of slides. So Jeffrey, can we close the poll even if everyone hasn't? I think the hourglass is running out of sand. Well, quite as much consensus on this one, was there? No answer, 40%. I don't know if people have gone to dinner or they just really couldn't respond to this. I hope it's the latter. We're coming to the end. Obviously, what we want for our low achievers is that they be engaged, that they not opt out, that they listen to understand, and that they learn from their classmates, because we do believe with Dylan William again that engaging in classroom discussion dialogue really does help students learn. And when we allow students to choose whether or not they'll participate, then we are really contributing to increasing that achievement gap. There's supports for equitable participation. We've alluded to many of them this afternoon. Certainly it begins and ends with culture, a culture in which students are supporting one another, a culture in which these other practices can take root. Response structures that support equitable participation, you know them as well as we do. It's being intentional, being consistent, in being committed to eliminate hand raising and replace it with these other options. Convincing our students that it's not okay to opt out, that we expect all of them to learn. And in regard to that, here are our candidates for expectations regarding participation. We know you'd want to word them to match your students' grade level, your content area, and so forth. But we, again, as with the purposes of questions, as with the think times, are convinced that unless we are explicit with the expectations, consistent with reinforcing them, collaborate with our students to get this done, that we cannot realize those three marvelous phases of quality questioning that could make so much difference for so many students. And so I think, Jill, it's time for me to toss the ball back to you. You may want me to move on even to the next slide and come back to the Q&A.
Sure. So like Jackie said, if you still have questions, please feel free to stay on. We'll be taking questions for a few more minutes. And thank you, Jackie, so much for a great presentation. I'm sure if you could hear everyone's audio, they would all be clapping. So as I'm sure most of you know, Jackie and her co-author, Beth, are the authors of several Corwin books, including the just released new edition of Quality Questioning, which you can find on Corwin.com. As a thank you for attending the webinar, please take 20% off any of these books, and you can use code E16C31 at checkout to get that discount. The code is good for a month, and it'll take 20% off your whole order. So if you buy 5 copies, it'll take 20% off of all of them. We are recording this webinar, so if you missed anything or you want to share it with your coworkers, we'll be sending you the recording in the next few days, and that email will also contain the discount code again. So be sure to join the rest of the Monday afternoon webinar series. We have 2 left. You can find those on Corwin.com, and thank you so much, Jackie.
Well, listen, thank you so much, Jill and Jeffrey, but most of all, thank you who took time out of, I know, a busy afternoon, many of you a late afternoon, to join us. I hope this has been worth your while, and I hope to continue the conversation with you either through Q&A here or on the Twitter feed. Thanks again, Connie. I see you've been mighty active up in Michigan. Just really so excited that you're engaged in quality questioning there in our Great Lakes state. Hope to hear some questions. Are there any?
Well, I had one that came through. Do you want me to ask it, or do you want to go ahead with the Twitter questions?
No, I think I'm not seeing questions so much as comments on Twitter. So Jeffrey, let's hear it.
The question I had came from Kathy. The question was, what inspired you to write about questioning? I thought that was a very interesting question. So jump right in.
Well, thank you, Kathy. I think very early in my career as a high school social studies teacher, I learned that standing and delivering was not working for my juniors and seniors, and I developed an interest in questioning in the classroom. Had always had an interest in questioning because we did a lot of that in my home, and I come from a home of educators. But with this real journey, I think, began for me as a first, second-year teacher. It's been a passion of my lifetime, and I think my early work with teachers in workshops on quality questioning convinced me that we needed to somehow put all the research together. There was a lot written on questions. There were some things written on wait time. There were some things written about, you know, how do you get students to respond, but I didn't see questioning as a system, questioning as a process. So that was what inspired the framework. Thank you for that question.
And that was all the questions that I had through Q&A. So I don't know if anything else came in through Twitter. I'll turn that over to you and Jill.
Okay, thanks, Jeffrey.
We also had a question from, we had one from Keisha asking what recommendations you have for training teachers on questioning. Maybe you want to talk about that new book.
I'm sorry, Jill. Could you repeat that? What recommendations do I have for what?
For training teachers on questioning.
Oh, for training teachers on questioning. Well, you know, I'd miss an opportunity if I didn't say use that 20% discount and buy that book for every teacher, right? Just kidding.
That's right.
I think what I would say is professional learning related to questioning needs to be, first of all, job embedded. It needs to happen within the context of the real life of classroom teaching and learning. It needs to be over time. It needs to be focused on an area of choice by a teacher. Quality questioning is very complex. Some teachers might want to begin their work by really putting their intentional focus of themselves and their students on questions, better crafting of questions prior to class, encouragement of student questions during class. Another teacher might want to use, say, an opportunity for real work on think time and working again with students on that. I think the learning is best done collaboratively, as I said, over time, job embedded, and done, I think, most of all with this belief that none of us ever arrives. Each of us can really target some area of questioning for improvement, and that we truly can learn from one another. In a PLC, I can't think of a better way to pursue questioning than for teachers to collaboratively create their questions during their PLCs or team meetings. And by the way, we've got a great example of that in the 5th chapter of the 2nd edition of Quality Questioning, where two very talented 3rd grade math teachers from Florence, Alabama are collaboratively planning a question. Powerful. Great professional development.
Terrific. There's 2 other questions that came in. One is, how do teachers stop questioning and hand off to students?
Well, I always say just get out the duct tape. That is probably the hardest part, is to stop talking, to stop speaking. But I think beyond that, teachers need a vision of what this restructured classroom will look like. They need a vision of how they can bring their students along on a journey of moving from students feeling that they are, you know, only to be passive observers of teacher talk in a classroom, of teacher work in a classroom, that they have the responsibility. And we would say, if you can really be intentional in over time conversation with your students about the 3 sets of expectations, of coaching them, of modeling for them, then they can develop those questioning skills, and we can then step back and truly be those coaches from the side. So I think both a willingness to relinquish control, which is difficult. I think it's very difficult for all of us who have, wanted to go to the front of the classroom. But believing that our students, when given the skills, can do those things themselves and with one another that perhaps we've been unable to do for them.
Terrific. I have one last question. What is the purpose for questioning in the classroom?
Well, I think I'll just have to go back and steal from Dylan Williams once again and say the purpose for questioning in the classroom, there are purposes. It's to promote student thinking, to generate from the student thinking responses that teachers can use as feedback to help move student learning forward, help to determine the next step in teaching. I think it's always also to do what we said from the outset, to prompt that student self-assessment. So I guess to bring this full circle, I'd say the purpose of questioning in the classroom is to really reveal those three phases: self-assessment, real genuine dialogue, and feedback we as professionals can use to help our students take their learning to that next step. If you can't tell, I'm real passionate about it. I've had the opportunity over many years to work with teachers who have made the commitment and made the changes. There are 21 videos in the second edition of Quality Questioning that really illustrate beautifully what dedicated teachers committed to this change can accomplish with their students and what these students will do when given that opportunity.
Terrific. That brings us to the end of the questions.
Yeah,
well, listen, can I just
remind that there's a great conversation still happening, still going on Twitter with that hashtag quality questioning. So, if you want to keep discussing with other educators, it seems like people are having a great time discussing with each other.
They really are. Now, hello, Keisha. So good to see you on. And Connie, I do love the resources from the Right Question Institute. So glad you have brought that to the attention of our chatters. But Jill, Jeffrey, thank you both for this opportunity. Thank you, Corwin. And thank all of you, again, who've dedicated your time today to this learning together. I really appreciate you. And I do hope you'll go back to our essential question that we opened the afternoon with. We feel very strongly that we can make a difference as educators. We've got to commit to it. Have a good evening.
Great. Thank you so much, Jackie.
Mm-hmm.